You can find all the deck lists in the video and more at the link in the description down below. Let's get started. This weekend kicked off the first of the new Magic Spotlight Series events, most hyped up for their comparison to the old Grand Prix events of the old Pro Play system. These open registration events, this one specifically, highlighted Foundation's Standard as the format of choice, and oh boy, did the players come out in droves for this one. 1,453 of them to be specific. This video is going to wind up recapping how the event played out, so it will spoil the results just to let you know in advance, so watch with care, and we'll go over what decks were most played in the room, which decks were most successful even if they didn't have the most copies in the room, and then take a look at the top 10 decks from Atlanta and see how they faced off head-to-head against one another in their matchup matrix of death, so you can figure out what you want to play this standard RCQ season at your local game stores. To go over how everything played out, the event was a 2-day open format standard slugfest, resulting in a top 8 that did wind up with 6 different archetypes overall. The fastest deck in the format in Gruul Aggro wound up taking up 3 of these slots, but was split between a more normal version and then a deck that was going a little bit more all in with Leyline of Resonance and Cacophony Scamp in the main deck. 2 Azorius decks did make the top 8, but under 2 different types of gameplay. The Azorius Aggro was a more convokeless convoke style, going wide and pumping things up, especially Warden the Inner Sky, while Azorius Oculus has kind of thrown us back to the standard Worlds metagame, looking to reanimate the powerful Abhorrent Oculus as soon as possible, alongside threats like Haughty and Monastery Mentor in some cases. Domain did wind up having a deck break the top 8, packing not just control elements, but Zur and the Duskmourn Overlords for a little bit of extra closing power. A fan favorite combo deck of the format, Temur Otters, looked to bounce and pump its way to victory, while a Dimir deck people didn't quite expect to be here cut the pixies from an Esper version of the deck and played its own bounce shenanigans, as the deck aptly named Dimir Pixie Cut by Ash Lizzle in her chat had the remaining slot in the top 8. Now, the non-Leyline Gruul decks unfortunately bit the bucket in the quarterfinals, while the Leyline version, Domain, Otters, and the Pixie Cut deck made the semifinals. Gruul went up against Domain in a matchup that looked a little bleak for the Gruul deck, as Domain had a chokehold until the very last second, where the Gruul list was able to explode at just the right time to literally steal the win right from Domain's fingers, while the Dimir Pixie Cut Enchantments deck was able to cut the Otters from the Otter combo deck, setting up a finals that had 2 color combinations that we may have expected to see, but in very different configurations from what we thought would be in the finals. Now, in that grand final, the Dimir Enchantments deck was stuck on 3 lands for a bit in game number 1, but had a ton of bouncing ability with This Town Ain't Big Enough, and the removal of Hexproof from Nowhere to Run kept it alive through an Emberheart Challenger onslaught, blanking Snakeskin Veils in the process, as the game kind of went on and was not able to really be an alpha swing with these pump spells that could protect a creature from being killed outright. Now, although it did survive at only 7 life, the Dimir deck unfortunately didn't draw enough lands in enough time to stabilize itself while providing extra protection from a follow-up attack from the Gruul side, thanks to Trample, which wound up giving Gruul game number 1. Now, in game number 2, we saw Dimir on the play and Gruul on a mulligan to 6, with Duress taking away a key pump spell as Cut Down took away creatures from the board, while This Town Ain't Big Enough kept the board clear and grew the amount of Otters from a Storm Chaser's talent that landed early on in the game. Gix's command about a turn or so later sealed the deal and forced a game-deciding or match-deciding game number 3, with the Gruul deck being on the play. Now, a Cut Down and a Flood Pitch Drowner from the Dimir side blanked the first 2 plays from the Gruul Aggro deck, taking down a Paw Patchery Crew and drowning an Emberheart Challenger for the time being, while Seek the Beast found an Innkeeper's Talent from the Gruul side to protect future creatures with the Ward ability, as long as there was no Nowheres to Run to be on the battlefield. Cacophony scams got quite large, dealing 17 out of the 18 damage needed to end the game, putting Dimir up against the ropes in just one singular attack. Now, needing to block every single creature and stun every single Heartfire hero that came down after, the pressure was too much as Nicholas and the Gruul deck emerged victorious from the first ever Magic Spotlight Series event as the winner. That was a quick recap of how the event's top 8 wound up running down, but I know everybody is kind of tuning into this video to see how the event kind of went as a whole and how all the different types of decks and their archetypes performed across a massive 2-day event. So before we hop into the meat and potatoes of this video, that data surrounding the event, we kind of need to talk about how it came to be. So we need to address some of the caveats to the data like I do every single time. Now for this event recap and most of my event recaps in the past, I am using the Melee platform, which has 1,453 registered players, all of them with deck lists. Huzzah! However, not all these deck lists were correctly identified, so I've had to go through and manually reclassify all of the deck archetypes as makes the most sense. So, for example, decks that were labeled as Jund Smuggler's Surprise that wound up being Mono White Caretaker's talent lists. Why do y'all do this to me? On the less troll side, I've also reclassified some of the decks where it makes more sense or better align with what you'll see in the deck when you take a look at it and kind of condensing those like-minded lists together into singular archetypes. For example, some of the lists that Melee had labeled as Mono White Midrange only ran angels in the deck for creatures, to the point that some of them were running up to 4 Cavern of Souls, so they could just name angels and other cards that cared about the kindred creature type. So I've renamed them something along the lines of Mono White Angels. Now the 2 biggest ones you're going to wind up seeing are the decks that fall into my Mono White Caretaker and Dimir Control or Simic Beanstalk list. So I guess it's 3, not 2. Sorry, I misspoke a little bit. But with the Mono White decks, all of them using the Caretaker's talent engine have been renamed as such as to match the nomenclature that all the other multicolor Caretaker talent lists had on the Melee platform. For some reason, Mono White was the only one labeled tokens as opposed to Caretaker's talent. Now, there are also a bunch of different lists floating around with domain as kind of a sub-theme or just 5 colors in general. So there is a deck named Zur Overlords, which is reserved for decks only running Overlords and Zur as creatures. So no Beza, no Atraxa, nothing of the like. Anything that has fallen into that category and runs the normal suite of removal, board wipes, and control elements has been reclassified as domain control, whether it has Zur or not, alongside those additional non-overlord creatures. Lastly, that Simic Beanstalk deck wound up including a bunch of decks that ran Rona's Vortex, even though there are Gloomlake Verges in the main deck and a Swamp in the sideboard in order to use that kicker cost. Now, to be classified as a Sultai Beanstalk list and not just the Simic Beanstalk list, I've gone with some of the kind of things I found online where the deck needs a card with a black mana pip in its mana value or converted mana cost on the top right of the card, not just the kicker. So one of these lists specifically was running Nowhere to Run in somewhere in the 75, so that would be a Sultai Beanstalk list, whereas the ones just running black for the kicker of Rona's Vortex, which did not come up all too often, at least I don't think it did, nothing that I saw when I was watching some of the gameplay this weekend, those decks have stayed as the Simic Beanstalk list. Now this is important because condensing all of these labels fills out the archetypes a lot more than some of the other breakdowns may be doing online, so that gives us a larger sample size of match data to draw our conclusions from, specifically in the head-to-head matchup matrix we'll see later on. Dang, well, that was a lot of kind of caveats to the data because there were a bit of messes when it came to the deck archetype name. So with all that fine print out of the way, let's get right into the decks that we saw in Atlanta. There were 115 unique deck archetypes across those 1,453 players in the room of Atlanta, with 44 of those 115, or 38.3% of them, being unique decks, aka the only copy of the deck in the room. 17.4% of the people had the same idea as exactly one other person, so 20 archetypes had 2 copies in the room, while 10 decks had 3 copies in the room, making up 8.7% for the trios. That meant 41 of the archetypes had 4 or more copies floating around the hall in Atlanta, or 35.7% of the players in total. Of all of those decks, Dimir Midrange was the clear winner as far as the popularity contest goes, making up 217 decks, or 14.9% of the metagame share, all by itself. Now, not far behind it was Gruul Aggro, with 197 decks of its own in varying configurations, making up 13.6% of the metagame share. Golgari Midrange was actually the 3rd most popular deck at Atlanta, with 126 copies and an 8.7% of the metagame share to its name. Esper Pixie was in 4th, despite all of the coverage it saw seeming like there was more, with 85 decks and 5.8% of the metagame share, while Domain Control, packing a lot of interaction, now had 80 copies for a 5.5% metagame share. Aggro without the green, aka mono red aggro, had 68 decks in the room for a 4.7% metagame share, while Jeskai Convoke was the other aggro deck en masse at ATL, with 59 decks and a 4.1% metagame share. Rounding out the top 10 for the metagame share decks was a somewhat forgotten deck from World in Azorius Oculus, bouncing back to 46 decks and a 3.2% metagame share, while tempo decks with crabs, terrors, and otters in Simic Beanstalk bounced its way to 42 decks and a 2.9% metagame share. Now, notable decks outside of these top 10 include Temur Otter's beloved combo deck with 2.7% metagame share, Azorius Aggro, aka the no convoke deck with 1.9% metagame share, 2 of those making the top 8, fan favorite Selesnya Tokens with 24 decks and a 1.7% metagame share that people like Doomwake took to an undefeated day 1, and finalist Dimir Enchantments, or the Pixie Cut deck that cut the pixies and I guess its hair, with 18 copies and a 1.2% metagame share. Now, before we go into the win rates for the decks, I'm going to divide them up by a metric that I like to call popularity. Pretty easy. For those who haven't seen my recaps before, this popularity assignment gives a letter grade to the deck based on how many copies it had in the room at the event. Basically, we're going to take how many decks were in the room and then look at how far above the average number of decks each archetype was. So if you're familiar with statistics, this is just standard deviation. So for this event, we're going to be looking at the number of decks an archetype had on average being 11. So decks that are 1 standard deviation below that are going to be C tier, and then above that are going to be B, A, and S tier. So anything that is going to be below that 1 standard deviation below the mean is going to be grouped together in a D tier for their popularity. Nothing goes all the way down to F because sometimes that would be a negative number, which can't exist. Now let's see how these decks performed in order of their popularity. Starting from the top of the class, we have our 3 S tier decks for the event: Dimir Midrange, Gruul Aggro, and Golgari Midrange. The Dimir deck came in as not only one of the most popular decks, but arguably one of the strongest in the eyes of many Magic players. Having the largest representation in the room and still putting up a 50.6% win rate goes to show that overall, people were pretty right to rate Dimir so highly. Likewise, the Gruul Aggro deck, it's a 53.0% win rate on average, so the deck has performed above the expectations that people had coming into this event, more likely due to the deck's strength in the metagame than it having 197 extremely strong pilots. Although that's not something to write off either, that probably could have happened as well. Now, Golgari Midrange, however, was one of the disappointments of these S-tier decks, as they can't all be bangers, and it only had an average of a 44.8% win rate overall, which is far below average and unfortunately an underwhelming result for a deck that was most likely picked because of the expected aggressive metagame it would face. Swapping down to the A-tier decks in popularity, we have another trio with Esper Pixie, Domain Control, and the Mono White Caretaker's Talent list. Now, the Esper Pixie deck was a hot list a lot of people were testing and talking about coming into the weekend, and it shone through having the 4th most decks in the room while putting up an absurdly high 57.8% win rate across all of its 85 pilots. That's an incredibly high win rate to decks ratio to have, putting Esper Pixie firmly towards the top tier of decks and potentially the metagame overall. Domain also put up decent results, with a 51.4% win rate, firmly cementing it as a powerful and popular choice in the current standard metagame. Now, Domain also seems to be one of the only real control options out there, and the package is fairly customizable without losing too much thanks to the Green Overlord enabling its namesake cards in and of itself by giving you an Everywhere token. Lastly, for A-tier decks, the Mono White Caretakers decks continued a bit of a trend in underwhelming performances across multiple formats, as we saw in Pioneer previously, as a 47.6% win rate overall isn't the worst of these S through C tier decks, but not a convincing metric to make anyone buy into the cards for RCQ season that doesn't already own this deck. The B-tier popularity decks, again, have 3 different archetypes to their name. And this was not planned and not always how it happens, by the way. But it had a pair of aggressive decks in Mono Red Aggro and Jeskai Convoke, with the reanimation package of Azorius Oculus coming in just below them. All 3 of these decks had a below average weekend though, with Oculus putting up the best results for this tier of decks with a 48.9% win rate. Despite Gruul putting up a high win rate, Mono Red wasn't able to replicate the same success despite having a large majority of the same main deck cards, going to show that the last sideboard cards like Pawpatch Recruits and Pawpatch Formation, alongside cards like Snakeskin Veil and Questing Druid, may be the breakers in a lot of these head-to-heads. Convoke actually had the lowest win rate of these 3, showcasing how cards like Split Up maybe making the turn everything sideways even before attacking might not be the best plan right now. Domain is running around in the A tiers, and Mono White Caretaker is up there with those in the numbers as well. Of all these decks, I'm most interested in Oculus out of the 3, as with this many copies in the room, I'm assuming that people didn't anticipate a lot of graveyard hate, which leaves the namesake card uncastable in a lot of situations, in addition to limiting the reanimation aspect. So I'm assuming that this was kind of a good metagame pickup because there weren't too many other graveyard decks that this would get splash damage from. C-tier decks were a lot more plentiful, putting up 9 decks with 12 or more copies in their room at the MSS. Of these decks, finalist archetype Dimir Enchantments put up the highest win rate we've seen so far, with a whopping 59.8% and 18 copies in the haul. The Pixie Cut deck, named for both the hairstyle and removing the namesake white card from the Esper list, did just fine without the 3rd color, showcasing the power of This Town Ain't Big Enough and Storm Chaser's talent with the core Dimir package of Floodpitch Drowner, Kaito, and plenty of removal. Silesia tokens also had a good weekend with a 53.4% win rate that would normally be the talk of the town if it weren't for the bounce-based decks. Almost having an affinity aspect to the list, as it could utilize cards like Sandstorm Salvager, almost like a Steel Overseer just for tokens, the list went wide enough and tall enough to punish the mix of decks in Atlanta. Boros Mice outperformed Boros Aggro, which basically have the same package, but the Aggro archetype opted for Enchantments Matter synergy over the Pump and Burn that the Mice package offered, while Simic Beanstalk put up a dead even 50% win rate and took the spotlight from cousin deck Temur Otters. Playing the strict tempo game over the combo-y sort of game was better for a large majority of pilots at the event, despite Temur Otters putting up a deck into the top 4. At the bottom of this section, we see Orzhov Midrange and Boros Burn, yet another Boros deck opting for low creature counts and higher amounts of Bolt Wave type spells. Meanwhile, the Orzhov deck saw many of the same flaws the Golgari did, but without key cards like Glissa to save itself in most cases, giving it the lowest win rate of all of the C tier or higher archetypes in popularity. That's how the popular kids played in Atlanta, but let's shift our gears and focus on the decks that ended up winning the most, regardless of how many decks were in the room. We're going to look at strictly results sorted by win rate overall, not total wins, so it matters more if you want a larger percentage rather than a larger amount of your games. A holdover from the last standard rotation, Temur Analyst took the top spot for winningest deck with a wild 73.3% win rate, losing only 4 matches all weekend. Now, the core of the deck lost its new Capenna fetch lands, but replaces them with a ton of lands that might be somewhere at the bottom of your chaff piles. Evolving Wilds got a reprint in Foundations, while Terramorphic Expanse was in Duskmourn, and combined with Fabled Passage from Eldraine to give the deck that wants to recur lands from its graveyard, in addition to Escape Tunnel, make up about 14 total lands that Aftermath Analyst and Lumra Bellow of the Woods can recur. This continues to spin the Nissa Resurgent Analyst engine, and thanks to her as well as Virtue of Strength, shooting deadly World Soul's Rage in a single blast. The deck retains its interesting way to ramp by using the Rage for small amounts early, recurring fetches to set up the game-ending turn much sooner. Now, there are 4 different archetypes tied at the 66.7% win rate, including a Kindred deck from quite the unlikely creature type, Dimir Zombies. Although no Cavern of Souls for the creature type is found in this list, so is it really a true Kindred list as much as it is a deck utilizing its own graveyard to discount creatures such as Writhing Necromass, Hollow Marauder, and Huskburster Swarm, and play a plethora of quote-unquote Gurmag Angler type threats as fast as possible. Impending an Overlord of the Baelmurk after landing a Fester Leech meant that you had 5 cards milled over already when you bring one back, setting up a turn 3 of potentially 2 to 3 creatures with 4 power or more hitting the battlefield at once. Additional threats like Souls of the Lost and Cruel Somniphage grew as large as the graveyard that they helped feed, and Overwhelming Remorse was used as a 1-mana Hera's Downfall that could exile threats for good thanks to its pumped up graveyard numbers. The Esper Reanimator, or Esper Omniscience deck, depending on how you want to look at it, also put up that 66.7% win rate and had multiple ways to put its large threats like Atraxa or Valgavoth into play. Squirming Emergence, Invasion of Tolvada, and Zombify can all get them out of the graveyard, while just casting Omniscience or bringing it back with an Emergence itself can get them out of your hand. The combination of Founding the Third Path and Wail of the Forgotten gets us up to 7 cards milled over in just 2 turns time, while Chapter 3 of the saga means we'll hit 10 by turn 4 for the earliest without using cards like Picklock Prankster's Free the Fae to mill us additional cards. Hitting targets and lands are key to keep getting things back ASAP with Squirming Emergence, giving this deck a solid plan of attack and a very strong graveyard synergy. Now, an actual Jund version of the Smuggler Surprise deck was also up there with a 66.7% win rate, using the Trojan Horse of a card to smuggle double dinosaurs into play to smash opponents into the ground. Now, specifically, the deck was looking to either use Trumpeting Carnosaur to discover into just about anything else in the deck to make 3 spells off of a Smuggler Surprise, or Vaultborn Tyrant as a large threat that draws cards and replaces itself, or Palani's Hatcher, which does an amazing Regisaur Alpha Broodmate Dragon impression, hashing an egg for 8 total power from the card, as well as giving all other dinosaurs haste. This means you can easily swing for 9 on the turn that you smuggle things into play, or for 16 if you happen to reveal 2 Hatchers. A Singleton Callous Sellsword also means that you can burn together half or throw the lethal dinosaurs in the air at someone in the pinch. Mono Blue Omniscience also hit that 66.7% win rate at the MSS, sporting one of the weirder combo finishes I've seen so far in Standard. Using a lot of ways to put cards into its graveyard and draw cards in the process, the deck utilized Reenact the Crime to try and reanimate a copy of Omniscience as early as possible to throw out an Evasion of Arcavios, which can then grab a bounce spell from anywhere, including outside the game, and recur itself a bunch of times. You can also flip a card I'm probably going to mispronounce here, Matzalanti, the Great Door, into a copy of the Core, and with a graveyard full of things, that Core will tap for enough mana to just cast your Invasion or your Omniscience in and of itself. Now, this deck has a lot of lines to play with it. Most of them I don't really know or could execute if you gave me the deck for the first time, but it includes some fun one-ofs in the sideboard, including the eventual win condition it looks like, which is Let's Play a Game, which is notably uncastable with the 23 islands in the main deck since it's a black card, and requires a Collector's Vault or the Core to cast if you cannot put Omniscience into play. The Dimir Enchantments makes the 6th spot in win rate with 18 decks in the room, making it the winningest deck list with more than one copy at the MSS. Now, the finalist archetype looks to leverage the same bouncing shenanigans that the Esper Pixie deck does with Fear of Isolation and This Town ain't Big Enough to keep the board locked down as it recurs threats like Storm Taser's talent and then utilizes Flood Pitch Drowner over and over again to tap down opposing threats and push through damage in sizable chunks. Differing from the 3-color list, this list still looks to leverage powerful cards like Kaito and Enduring Curiosity alongside the Bounce engine to make its Dimir deck a bit more tempo-focused than its mid-range brethren. Speaking of the Esper Pixie deck, here it is, and it's almost unheard of to see the 4th most popular deck in the room crack the top 10 win rate decks as well, let alone doing it with such a high win rate like Pixie does at a 57.8% win rate. The deck utilizes the same bounce spells as its Dimir cousin, but adds in a package of Nurturing Pixie and Optimistic Scavenger for an additional recursion spell, and the ability to spread +1/+1 counters across its many different threats for replaying the enchantments that you're happy to bounce with your Pixies and all of your other spells. Spiteful Hexmage makes an appearance in some lists as a 3/2 beater for 1 that has almost no downsides when curved before Pixie, while Tithing Blade gives this deck an Edict effect in addition to as many nowhere to runs as it can cast to take down seemingly protected threats. Now, Orzhov's Caretaker's talent list proved to be where those unfortunate Orzhov mid-range lists wanted to be, with the 8th highest win rate off the back of Caretaker's talent Beza the Bounding Spring package that sprinkled in some of Black's greatest hits in the standard metagame, mostly removal spells. However, being Orzhov also gave you Kumbal, Profiteering Mare, which provides a drain angle for creating tokens off of Carrot Cake, Fountain Pour, etc., while Kaya, Spirit's Justice, can turn a lowly rabbit, fish, or treasure into a Beza or Overlord of the Mistmords with flying for a turn. Esper Aristocrats used a combo of Raise the Past and creatures with mana value 2 or less to grind games out while creating an extremely large Bartolomé del Presidio, which I probably have mispronounced unfortunately, in the process, packing itself full of creatures with beneficial ETBs and dies triggers, as well as cards like Tarian's Journal to trigger them while drawing additional cards. This deck is something I'm excited to try out in the format. Now, Elis Ilkor was the drain outlet of choice here to gain life on ETB and then drain life on death, although Vengeful Blood Witch is a non-legendary option if you wish to run multiple copies of a card to drain life here. Lastly, in the 10th spot for win rate, we have an Azorius version of the deck trying to play Omniscience as quickly as possible. Only this one is splashing white in order to use Abuela's Awakening into play as soon as turn 4. From there, it has the same similar play pattern with Evasion of Arcavios as the mono blue deck does, only it's using Season of Weaving to recur itself over and over again. This allows you to spend 5 of your total paw prints of action on copying a creature by making a token of it, as well as bouncing each non-land, non-token thing that you own. So your Awoken Omniscience creature, tokenize that, bounce the real deal, end your invasion, and go to town. Your literal army of Omniscience will end the game. That wraps up what decks, despite their numbers, had the highest win rate, so let's shift our gears and look at how the decks with the most copies in the room did against one another to paint a better picture as to what you might expect to see during your own RCQ season. As mentioned before, Dimir Midrange was the prom king of the event, but did have a target on its back going into Atlanta. Despite a decent showing overall, it was clear that certain archetypes had an edge against the top deck. Gruul Aggro, Esper Pixie, and Jeskai Convoke used their wider board presence and speed to put the deck off beat and had positive win rates against the deck while doing so. Likewise, the Azorius Oculus deck punished Dimir for only having one true way to kill the namesake eyeball, while amassing a board of 2/2 Manifest Dread creatures meant a lot of the evasive threats from Dimir couldn't win the damage race, while the ground threats got kinda gummed up. And if you flipped into one of the threats from the Azorius Oculus deck, well, good luck. The worst of the decks to see as Dimir, though, was the Simic Beanstalk deck, as in a head-to-head game of we both want the tempo. The deck built to play larger threats ahead of schedule and bounce things the turn Dimir needed to tap out ended up winning almost 2 out of 3 times. However, the Dimir deck still punished the more linear aggro strategies such as mono red, as well as reign supreme on the board in matchups against mid-range decks like Golgari and Caretaker's Talent. A solid matchup spread against the field helped Dimir maintain its higher win rate, even if it did struggle against about half of the top decks in the room. Gruul Aggro was fast enough to get under almost every mid-range and control deck at Atlanta this weekend, only really struggling a tiny bit against the Golgari shell that seemed like it was designed to beat them. Decks that could run Authority of the Consuls were a bit of an issue, and while Domain decks were too slow to punish Gruul consistently, the mono-white Caretaker deck was just right for beating out the aggro plan. Esper Pixie was also a bit of an issue, as bouncing mice doesn't allow for their dice triggers to happen, and recursive removal in the form of bouncing a nowhere to run proved to be a problem for Gruul all weekend. But decks that didn't remove Hexproof couldn't compete with Innkeeper's Talent and Snakeskin Veil. However, its spread against 7 of the 10 top decks was extremely favored, so it's for sure a deck to consider bringing to an RCQ yourself, or at the very least, having a solid game plan to play against. Golgari Midrange was a popular deck that really aimed at punishing the lower aggressive decks in the room, and it did that fairly well. Unfortunately for Golgari, most of the decks in the room, especially the top 10 ones, weren't your traditional aggro decks and either went wider, slower, or just plain over the top. Glissa and Preacher locked down the ground as early as Tan 2 with a Land War Elf to power them out, while Removal Aplenty takes care of threats of most sizes, but needing to tap out to deploy most of its game-impacting cards meant decks like Simic Beanstalk feasted on the traditional rock-style deck. Domain Control was also happy to play a draw-go game and remove the smaller number of threats, saving its larger game-ending spells for later. The Golgari list did not pack as many impactful interaction spells in the main deck, meaning that it was always fighting on the back foot in sideboard games when Domain could kind of adjust its own game plan to combat exactly what Golgari was bringing in. Esper Pixie was the breakout deck of the tournament for most people, and its head-to-head against the top decks in the room makes a good argument for it being one of the best decks in the format, period. Above 60% win rates against half of the most played decks in the room is an amazing place to be, especially when that spread includes aggro and mid-range decks alike. The only 2 decks that seemed to be speed bumps for the Pixie crew were the mono-white decks and the Azorius Oculus decks. Mono-white Caretakers packs very few creatures that you want to bounce while keeping its life total high and hand fairly restocked in the process. Likewise, the Azorius Oculus deck is doing some unfair things of its own rather quickly, like reanimating a 5/5 as early as turn 2, so you don't always have the chance to set up your board and start the bounce house against both of those decks. However, picking up Esper Pixie as a deck slated to do well against both Dimir and Gruul is an excellent option for people in RCQ season. Domain was the control shell of choice and honestly came out with shockingly large numbers for the MSS. The deck absolutely preyed on the more dirtily of the mid-range decks like Golgari or mono-white Caretakers, while also flattening some of the more linear aggro strategies like Jeskai Convoke. It also put up surprisingly good results against Azorius Oculus and Simic Beanstalk, with the latter of those decks being way more tuned against creature reliant decks to use all of its unsummoned type effects on. Domain did struggle against Gruul, as it was one of the fastest decks in the room, as well as the Dimir matchup, which was a little surprising since it did well against other mid-range decks. The mixing in of counter magic as well as hand disruption meant that Dimir could punish Domain when it controlled the tempo of the game a lot easier than other mid-range decks could that lack the permission blue gives you and the fact that they can't run Kaito. Mono-white Caretakers is a deck with lots of fans hanging around the format and didn't do too badly against the top decks in the room. With a winning matchup against 6 of the 10 top decks, Mono-white was tuned to fight the aggro decks and was able to be one of the few decks that had a winning head-to-head against the Esper Pixie deck. For all of the board lockdown that the deck offered, it couldn't really contend with Domain as a true control deck, at least in the head-to-head control matchup, since it lacks a lot of interaction for spells. spells, while the Simic Beanstalk deck was able to turn its unsummons into Doomblades against the all tokens deck that the white deck relies on making, as well as being able to reset their namesake card Caretaker's talent in the worst possible spots for the white deck. Mono red aggro probably should have had a better weekend if you compare it to its Gruul Aggro sibling, but the deck fared far worse than the green splash gets credit for. The only decks that Mono Red was able to consistently defeat were the Jeskai Convoke and Simic Beanstalk decks, with the additional burn spells some lists ran being able to grind out the last point of damage that the creatures weren't able to push through there. However, into a field of mid-range decks and most importantly Authority of the Consuls, the red deck lacked an extra card velocity granted by Seek the Beast and instead relied on cards like Urabrass Forge and Brute Strength to try to tackle its grindy matchups, which unfortunately did not pan out against decks like Golgari specifically that came out specifically to beat this deck. Jeskai Convoke had a similar weekend to Golgari where it did not quite perform to its expectations, but seemed to do decently into the targeted matchups it wanted to see. In this case, Convoke lined up well against the non-white mid-range decks, where the go-wide aspect was a lot harder to deal with outside of cards like Gix's Command, as many of the Dimir and Golgari lists weren't running packages of Glistening Deluge in the sideboard anymore. It, however, did not fare well against the mono-white Caretakers or domain control decks, as their package of board wipes starting at 3 CMC were just too much for Jeskai to push through in most matches. One upside was a positive win rate against the Simic Beanstalk deck, although a smaller match sample size is given here. While bouncing a stacked Warden might be good, getting to replay ETB creatures and continue to grab cards off of a bounced Knight Errant isn't where the Simic deck really wants to be, while the board from Jeskai's side can get large quickly and one-for-one removal, air quotes, in this case, is not the best. Azorius Oculus is in an interesting position after not seeing much play post-Worlds, as the deck had an even or better matchup into 8 of the 10 top presence decks in the room, but had a below average win rate across the entire weekend. This meant the deck suffered against a wide variety in the field, most likely encountering decks that had natural or prepared graveyard hate for the deck's plan A. Gruul Aggro was a deck that, while it didn't have graveyard hate, packed a full amount of Paw Patch formation post board to deal with the namesake card of the deck in a very clean way. Likewise, the domain control deck that can continuously wipe the board of all things the Oculus deck is fighting to put on there can be pretty rough. Otherwise, the deck is both fast enough and quote-unquote unfair enough to have a positive win rate against most of the mid-range matchups it faces. Lastly, we find the deck trying to do both tempo and unfair things all in one package, the Simic Beanstalk deck. It's no surprise that the deck looking to cheat large things into play at a discount had a great win rate against the fair mid-range style decks, but where it suffered were the decks that went above or below it, specifically these aggro and control matchups it faced. Without an Up the Beanstalk, the deck's number of unsummon effects didn't do much against decks like Domain Control, and not being able to string together draws meant it tires itself out quite quickly. Meanwhile, against decks like Gruul, bounce spells for low mana seem great until they run into a wider board or the hexproof and ward clauses from Innkeeper's Talent and Snakeskin Veil. Without a card like Nowhere to Run, all the power was on Gruul's side's hands, making it a rough time to kind of interact against their onslaught of mice. The deck also struggled against Esper Pixie, taking away the protection cards, or protection from cards like Tolarian Terror, usually allowing it to be bounced and killed just like any other threat, since that ward was no longer there thanks to Nowhere to Run. So after all of that breaking things down, that's what the standard metagame looked like at the first ever Magic Spotlight series in Atlanta. So, are there any decks that you thought did better than you thought you would coming into the beginning of the event? What about decks that sort of underperformed in your eyes? And most importantly, are there decks that you saw that inspired you to build them for your own RCQ grind? Now let me know down in the comments below, and while you're down there, make sure to thumbs up the video if you've enjoyed it so YouTube knows that you're locked in for standard season. Now I also want to take a moment to thank all of my members for supporting this video specifically, as well as all the videos that you can see on my channel. If you would like access to membership perks that these fine people do, that's over here, not over there, such as having Discord access, so you can have a direct line to me, or getting some of your own personal deck techs on the side, you can, of course, click the join button down below the video, or the join button that is over on my main homepage on YouTube, so that you can show your devotion to the channel. And as always, you can just tap that subscribe button to stay up to date on the latest deck techs, metagame analysis, and just in general, Magic the Gathering content from me. See you at the RCQs, everyone!